Anyway, everyone, thank you for joining us for this evening's talk. I mean, our talks are a really important part of our educational programme, alongside our statutory role of commenting on planning applications to Westminster City Council, as we try to attempt to protect the buildings and open spaces of this historic area. I'd just like to introduce you to Jules, who many of you will know, who's our secretary, and she's behind the IT and making it all happen. And with a record 52 people registering for the talk, Jules will certainly have her hands full. And the next time she'll be doing that, I hope, is on the 11th of May, and just a date for your diary, but I will include it in my follow-up email to this evening's talk, which is given by our member, Rosalind Vincent, and we're really pleased about that, who's going to talk about being in the shadow of St. John's Smith Square. Anyway, I'm Sue Ball, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the chair of the Thorney Island Society. So a particular welcome to our non-members, our members, and particularly our new members who are joining us for the first time this evening. And I'd like to give a special greeting to our member Mike in Adelaide, Australia, who either is going to bed very late or is up very early to join us this evening. And also to Chris, who was the winner of our Christmas quiz 2020. And I had the pleasure of meeting Chris, safe distancing, of course, a couple of weeks ago, to present him with his prize, which is a treasured Thorney Island mug. So it's good to see you here, Chris. Before I start this evening's talk and introduce you to our speaker, Jules will put everyone on mute, and you have screen shared with Elizabeth. Great, okay, so that we have no background noise. So Elizabeth is going to speak for between 45 minutes and an hour, and followed by Q&A. Now we expect there to be loads of questions, so please put them in the chat. But if you'd prefer, I mean, Jules will read them out, but if you would prefer at the end to ask them directly, or just stick up your hand and we will try and keep an eye on you and bring you into the meeting. Elizabeth is a historian and an academic, and she's going to talk to us this evening about rediscovering the medieval palace of Westminster. So Westminster before 1512, from when only 3 buildings remain, having survived bombs, fire and floods. And at least they didn't have to, or she didn't have to, contend with developers in our local area and the planning department of Westminster City Council, where some of us were engaged at very late on a Sunday evening when something occurred which really should not have done. So important for amenity societies like ours to keep abreast of what's happening and try and do something about it. But I don't want to distract from Elizabeth's really important work. She's going to be also referring to her latest book, which is, this is our copy from which I just picked up from our archives in Old Pye Street just about an hour ago. But Elizabeth completed her PhD at York University in 2016 on St. Stephen's College as part of the project to digitally reconstruct the lost building. She's held a series of research fellowships and teaching posts, and currently is a research fellow on a fascinating project called Beyond 2022 at Trinity College, Dublin. We could talk about that for ages. She's editing the surviving documentation of the medieval Irish Exchequer, and I'd love her to talk to us about that, but unfortunately it's not in Thorney Island, but it's terrific to have her talk about Westminster this evening. So over to you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, and thank you for that extremely generous introduction. And I hadn't quite realised that, of course, I don't have to deal with the planning department by the virtue of working on buildings that never knew planning departments in any type. So what I want to do tonight is to use the surviving buildings of the medieval Palace of Westminster to think about the range of activities that happened in that palace, and to give you a sense of the sheer variety of things that went on within its walls. As I'm sure most of you know, there's been a palace on the site of the current Houses of Parliament since the mid-11th century, when Edward the Confessor completed his grand project of building both a palace and an abbey side by side, Westminster to match St Paul's Cathedral, which is sometimes called the Eastminster. And there isn't anything at all really that survives of that project, but there are elements that survive from the later Middle Ages of the centuries of building work that followed Edward the Confessor's projects. So let's start by looking at the palace as it was in the first known image we have of it. This is an early 16th century image. It's anonymous. We don't know who drew it, looking at Westminster Palace from across the river. So I've given you a roughly similar view across the river to today's Houses of Parliament to help orientate yourself. And as you can see, it is nothing like Barry's magnificent 19th century achievement, but there are some things that we can point out that I hope will be familiar to you. We can see the long roof of Westminster Hall along the right hand of your screen, that long oblong up there, and I hope Westminster Abbey at the back will be very familiar indeed too. So we've got Westminster Abbey and Westminster Hall, but there are other elements of the palace that also survive but are now hidden within Barry's palace. And just before I show you the plan and we start trying to make sense of this building, I'll point out that to the south here, in front of Westminster Hall, it's a real hodgepodge of buildings. It's a real maze of things that were put up over the centuries and that we still don't have a very good understanding of today, because they were mostly swept away before the 19th century, and the archaeology has been partially done but has also been very difficult to do. So to the south, we've got this hodgepodge of buildings, and to the north, we've got these low-lying buildings ending in the tower at the edge of Westminster Hall. That's the seat of the Exchequer, which was 11th century. That's one of the oldest bits that you can see on this drawing. Now, Westminster's really important for all of the reasons you might imagine, you know, home of Parliament, home of government, the King's home. But what makes it really special in this late medieval period from the 14th to the 16th centuries is that it's the palace the Kings of England use most often. If you look at the period between 1340 and 1500, the Kings of England on average spend between a third to a half of the year at the palace. And that includes in the average years, such as the years when Henry V is on campaign in France, and so is not in England at all, through to years such as those when Henry VI spends all his time at the medieval palace. So it covers the full range of occupation. And the moment at which this conglomeration of medieval buildings, that is King's home, administration, the law courts, a place that people visit for all sorts of reasons, really changes, comes at the end of the 15th century, when the whole idea of a royal home is completely transformed. And I'll come on to talk about what that means for part of the palace. But its real end of a medieval palace comes both with the 1512 fire that Sue mentioned at the start, after which it's much less used, but the final moment at which everybody goes, no, Westminster is not the King's home, comes in 1529, when Henry VIII acquires York Place, and then in 1530 starts building what the building accounts call engines to take down the walls of some of the medieval palace so that the brick can be reused at what he's now building at Whitehall to the north. So we're looking at this moment from the 13th to the 16th centuries when Westminster is a dizzying array of things, and this is the view that you would have gotten of it had you stood on the Lambeth riverside looking across. So let's sort of think about how we can categorize different areas of the palace very roughly. This is a very rough way of dividing it up. This is the 1960s historical drawing map of Howard Colvin from his History of the King's Works, in which he attempts to survey every bit of building work that the King of England did from the Middle Ages through to the 19th century. But his plan of medieval Westminster is really useful because it gives us a good way to start thinking about the different areas that make up this palace in this period. So I've very roughly, with coloured boxes, which I hope are clear, divided up the palace by what I would call sort of functional areas. So the first functional area, which is centred around Westminster Hall, the Great Hall in Colvin's plan, is what I would call public space. It's space where anyone can walk in and go and find what they need in terms of government, you know, whether it's to go to Westminster Hall, whether it's to go to the offices of the Exchequer and the Privy Seal and all the other things that surround Westminster Hall. But it also at times extends south, which is why I've overlapped it with the Privy Palace, to the Lesser and Whitehall and the Painted Chamber, which are just within the top of the blue box there, because those are the spaces Parliament tends to use in the later Middle Ages. Not always, not completely, but the state opening of Parliament, for example, is usually held in the Painted Chamber, and then the Lords will meet either in the Queen's Chamber or the Lesser Hall. So there's some expansion of public space that happens, but the red is very much space in which you could wander in off the streets, no questions asked, as it were. The second area, and that area is unusual, that doesn't exist in any other English royal palace of the period. There would be much stricter controls about who could come in and who might not come in. The second area, which I've marked in blue, is the kind of things you would expect at a royal home, and it's the least well-known area of the palace. It's the Privy Palace to the south, where the king lives, and where, if he is at Westminster for that third to a half of the year, he will be living and his household will be around him. And it's probably also one of the more comfortable palaces that they come to, because it's one of the few that has running water from the middle of the 14th century. And then the third area of the palace, which I deliberately pulled out from the other two, is St Stephen's Chapel and College, because from 1348, that was essentially a religious liberty controlled by the Dean and Canons of St Stephen's, and they had that waterfront between the Exchequer and the chapel itself here. So what we've got is a kind of three different sets of functional buildings that share a site and that have some overlaps. And what I want to do for the rest of the talk is use what survives from each of them to give you a sense of how they might have been used or what we know about them and how they all fit together into the multi-layered world that was late medieval Westminster. So let's start with the public palace, with the area that you could, as it were, wander into without question. So let's go first. This is New Palace Yard at the northern end of the palace. You can see Westminster Hall at its north end here. And this is unfortunately a 17th century image. We don't have any earlier images, as far as I know, of this area. But this is the gateway to the palace. This is where you would come, and where the viewpoint is as you look at this image is the Watergate. Most traffic to Westminster in the medieval period comes by water from London. You wouldn't come down the road, it's too dirty and dusty and just uncomfortable. You take a barge down river, or from either upriver or downriver, depending on which way you were going. You would come out at the King's Watergate, and then you would come into New Palace Yard. And what I really like about this hollow image from the mid-17th century is it gives you a sense of how bustling and busy and distinctive this area was. You can see the carriages waiting, you can see the kind of entrance, still the entrance today, of course, to Westminster Hall here, and you can see a hint of the buildings that surround Westminster Hall, which house the various departments of government. And this area gets used a lot in the later Middle Ages for ceremonial. So in 1486, I'm sorry, when Henry VII returns from his first progress around England after his victory at Bosworth, the first time he's been seen across England as the King of England, he comes here to the Watergate, and he is met at the Watergate in New Palace Yard by the monks of Westminster Abbey in full coats and regalia, and by the Dean and Canons of St. Stephen's Chapel, which would be just down to off to the left of the image, and is processed ceremonially through New Palace Yard, through the gatehouse at the back, and over to Westminster Abbey for a Mass of Thanksgiving, essentially. So it's this kind of very ceremonial, this is a space that can get used ceremonially, that will be visible to all those who happen to be at Westminster. This is also the area that a few years late, 20 years later, when he's celebrating the marriage of his eldest son, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, they will have set up the tilting space, and there will be stands for spectators, and it will be a very busy, very loud event there. So Westminster Hall sits within very public space before you even get inside. And then if we move inside, as it were, to Westminster Hall as it is today, the hall of course is rarely this empty, but it's a nice image of it. The Westminster Hall is one of those spaces, both then and now, which serves as a stage for all sorts of things that can be cleared very quickly to hold different kinds of events. And I want to sort of think about Westminster Hall in two stages. First, to think about ceremonial and feasting and events, the kind of things where you hold really big parties in this space. And then I want to think about what it's used for on a kind of day-to-day royal government level basis as well. So the thing that we associate most strongly with this space, with Westminster Hall, with that fabulous late 14th century hammer beam timber roof by Hugh Herland, completed in 1399, is royal events. You know, this is a hall which has the heart badge of Richard II all over it. It has all of the royal heraldry in use and under Richard II, plastered everywhere that the king can possibly put it. You know, it's very much a ceremonial royal space. But those events happen, you know, relatively infrequently in the life of the hall. And it would get only really used for the biggest of events. And the reason I've given you the picture on the left, which is from a British Library manuscript showing feasting at the court of King Arthur from a 15th century, from a 15th century manuscript, is because there's a feast that goes wrong in Westminster Hall in the 1350s. In the late 1350s, Edward III is at the height of his success in the 100 Years' War. He's just about to conclude the Treaty of Bretigny, which allows him to consider himself King of France. He has the King Jean of France as a captive in the Tower of London. And he's just paraded the French king through the streets of London. And the Londoners think, well, this is a massive event. There should be a feast to celebrate this. We'll go to Westminster. And the chronicler tells us that they think these Londoners, these members of the guilds of the city, that the Black Prince, Edward III's eldest son, has invited them to a feast. So they come to Westminster Hall and they sit in Westminster Hall. and go, where is this feast? Because they're clearly expecting something like in the image on the left, you know, lavish gold plates, you know, lots of people eating really good food, so on, and drinking good wine imported from Gascony. But they don't get it, and they sit there for quite a number of hours, probably getting tireder and tireder and crosser and crosser. And then eventually one of them goes, well, we should find out what's happening. Why isn't there a feast? And you can see at the back of Westminster Hall on this image, there's that massive archway. That's built by Charles Barry. That's not there in the medieval hall. There's a much smaller door in that wall, but there is a door in that wall. So they go through that door, expecting that they'll find, you know, a feast in preparation, and they were just a few hours early. Instead, they're stopped and they're questioned because nobody seems to have cared that they were sitting in the hall itself. That doesn't seem to be a problem. It's a public space. There's lots going on. A bunch of people sitting in a corner. Who really cares? But the second they move beyond that southern edge of Westminster Hall into the Privy Palace, into the much more restricted royal living quarters, that's when they get stopped and questioned. And that's a very clear divide between the public palace and the Privy Palace. But there are other more successful feasts in Westminster Hall. That's the only one I know of where there's been a massive mix-up. The other kind of things you see are, for example, one of the ironies that I quite like about Westminster Hall is that it's rebuilt, of course, at the expense of Richard II, who's pouring huge amounts of money and time into this building to build that amazing roof and to redecorate the walls. But it's not actually finished in time for him to ever use it. The first major event, as far as I'm aware, that gets held in Westminster Hall with this roof is the coronation feast for his usurper and successor, Henry IV. So Richard II builds it, Henry IV gets to be the first one to use it for a really big event. And the other kind of, and another sort of coronation story from this space is, if you look at the line of windows along the image, the very furthest window, they cut through that window and built a gallery for Henry VIII in 1533 so that he could watch the coronation of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, from there. He wasn't allowed at the feast itself, but he could watch from a window. So he has them build in a little balcony for him. So that's Westminster Hall and its kind of more ceremonial Great Hall aspect, but there's a lot more to it than that. If we now look at what's going on there ordinarily, this is what makes Westminster so special, I think, in this period, and why the Kings of England have to spend so much time here between the third to a half of the year, is because Westminster Hall is the absolute hub of medieval government. And that's not, you know, automatic. There's nothing particularly in the reigns of the Angevin kings that says everything will end up at Westminster. Yes, it has the coronation church, but otherwise it's one palace among many that those kings use. Instead, what really shifts it is a decision made in 1215 when King John is forced by the barons in Magna Carta to accept that justice will no longer follow the king. Because if you had been someone who needed to access the law courts under Henry II, good luck. You would have to find where the king was, or where the itinerant justices were going if they were moving separately from the king. But they're just constantly moving around. And John is forced by the barons to say, I will appoint one place for the holding of the courts. And they choose Westminster, convenient to London. Westminster Hall is big. You can fit, as they do end up fitting, 3 or 4 courts at a time, meeting at the same time into the hall. And once the law courts sort of go, yes, this is where we're based, anyone can come to Westminster and be assured of finding the courts and can start the process in one fixed place. So they're not traveling around chasing after Henry II as he goes pelting around the country. everything else follows. So at first, the writing offices, the offices that you come to get documentation, if you need to prove your ownership of land, or if you need to start a court case, or if you need anything else, you're going to need Chancery, the writing office of the king. That settles down at Westminster. And so people who need documentation come to Westminster. And then the last of the big organisations to settle down at Westminster is the one on the right of your screen, the Exchequer, which they experiment with and they toss around a couple of places, and Edward II moves it to York so that's closer for the Scottish Wars. But then by the 1340s, it too has firmly settled at Westminster. And that is important because if you come to Chancery, if you need documentation, you come to the Exchequer to deal with finance in any form. And as you can see here in this image from the Black Book, from the Red Book of the Exchequer, it shows the Exchequer at work, all of the clerks gathered around the table with the documentation of the money that's been paid in and paid out. You can see they're counting money on the table, that little pile of rather donutty looking things there. And at the end of the table, with his back to us, the sheriff is waiting to hear if they agree with his accounts. So if you have any financial connection whatsoever with the medieval government, you have to come to Westminster. The most obvious people to come are the sheriffs because they have financial responsibilities to discharge, but you'll find, quite humble people turning up at Westminster to pay in a small sum of money that they owe the king, or to be paid for a small sum of money that they're owed for something they've done. So the Exchequer reaches quite deep into medieval society, and it's at Westminster. So it's adding to the press of people coming for the law courts or Chancery for Exchequer to access government. And while they're there, they can see any spectacle that the king is putting on, whether it's that procession from the Watergate to the Abbey that Henry VII did that I mentioned earlier, or whether that's just the routine business of the court, as in the king's household. And on the left, what I've given you is a lovely late 15th century image of the Star Chamber, which is called that because it has a blue ceiling with gold stars on it. So some of the early accounts call it the Starred Chamber, describing the painting process. And the Star Chamber becomes really important later as a court, as a place where a court meets in its own right. But all through this period, it's just off Westminster Hall, and it's where the council meets. So it's where you can come and say, I have a grievance or something's gone wrong, and I don't think any other court will be able to handle it. Can you make me right? And the King's Council is expected to find ways to provide a resolution, to provide what the technical term is equity. And so again, you get this really strong association by the 15th century between Westminster, the place, and government. And there's a couple of quotations that I really like for showing you what that means. The first comes from the 1480s when the Duke of Suffolk, it's in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, the Duke of, 1450s, the Duke of Suffolk, at the very start of the Wars of the Roses, writes to John Paston, who's a friend of his, and says, well, I'm now at Westminster, and now I will do everything I can to sort out the politics. You know, now being at Westminster, I shall labour everything for the good of the country, is the phrasing he uses. So that really tight association between, yes, I turn up at Westminster to try and get things done for the nation as a whole, starts really quite early because of this very tight association between the institutions that people need to access and the spaces they occupy around Westminster Hall. The second, and I love it for how much it says about how uncertain everything must have felt, comes from 1483. So Edward IV has just died. His young son, Edward V, has not yet arrived at Westminster. He's being brought from, I think it's Ludlow, to Westminster. And no one's sure what the king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, is going to do. And one of the people who lives at Westminster writes again to a member of the Paston family and says, I hope everything's all right with you, because with us there is much doubt, and every man doubts other. And that sense of watching here at the centre as Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and Henry V are both expected to arrive to the place where one or the other of them will end up controlling government, and thus the political world more broadly. Of course, Simon Starworth, who wrote that, did not know that Richard III would end up being king for just 2 years, and that Starworth would end up dying under his successor, Henry VII, many years later. So he did get through the turmoil of 1483. So royal government in its broadest sense, of course, included the Parliament. But the reason I haven't emphasized Parliament here, although it's very important, is because Parliament was sort of on top of the existing elements of royal government when it was present. Parliament took over rooms that were used for other things. So they went into the Painted Chamber, and the various rooms the House of Lords used, and the Commons went across the road to Westminster Abbey. So they're sort of added on top, and the life of the courts and these major offices continues. And indeed, Parliament draws on these major offices. It's no accident that the clerk of the parliaments for the medieval period is almost invariably, I can't think of an exception, but I'm sure there will be one, there always is with medieval history, is one of the clerks of chancery. So one of the people who usually is writing the royal records gets seconded over, as it were, to Parliament to keep Parliament's records. So there's a really tight association between Parliament and administration for the later Middle Ages. So let's now think about the Privy Palace, which is a much more ordinary area of medieval Westminster. It's much less well known. I can't show you as many images of it because so much of it was taken down in the centuries after 1512. And indeed, Henry VIII started it when he started ripping down the walls to build Whitehall. But the thing I really like to emphasize tonight about the Privy Palace is that it's never just one thing. There's always work going on. There's always some kind of repairs, some kind of new building, some kind of project going on, which makes it really hard to even begin to say, okay, this is what it's like at any one moment. And one of the things that exemplifies that is precisely why the palace is abandoned as a royal home after around 1512. It's because if you look at that map, you can see how there's sort of lots of little rooms, we think, that interconnect. You can see walls here and there's some possible walls here, and it all kind of ends up being a bit of a rabbit warren. And that is not at all what Henry VII or Henry VIII expects in a royal home. They, influenced by the late 15th century developments in European palace architecture, really want the kind of spaces you find at, for example, in the surviving buildings, Hampton Court, where you move from, Great Hall, which is relatively open, to increasingly more controlled rooms along a gallery, which end in very private lodgings for the king. That's not at all what you get at Westminster. Westminster, by its very nature, is intensely public because of the presence of the Great Hall and all of the things that surround that in terms of administration. And it's also absolutely impossible to control in terms of access once you're past the Lesser Hall. So from 1502, when Henry VII completes his work at Richmond and his slightly earlier work at Greenwich, that becomes the favoured royal homes. It's they're private, they're more controlled. You aren't necessarily on view in the same way that you are at Westminster, but they still have to come to Westminster for major events. So there's a couple of major events I want to highlight here while we've still got the map, so that helps you see what's going on. So in 1501, the future Henry VIII is made a Knight of the Bath at the time of his brother's marriage. And they hold the ceremonial, as you would expect, in the Privy Palace. He spends the night in St. Stephen's. But what's really interesting about how they describe him leaving the palace afterwards, they say that he moved privily and secretly through the Privy Palace, then and took his horse at the water gate here, here at the northern end. So he bypasses Westminster Hall, so he moves through St. Stephen's College, which is more private, and then can get away quietly. But it's a real sense of, you know, the sense of what do we want to show, what do we not want to show. And the one bit of the Privy Palace that has survived is down here in the corner of my blue box. It's the Jewel Tower, right tucked away from the rest of the Privy Palace. There would have been, all of the in-between area would have been filled with buildings. But the Jewel Tower is interesting, not least because it survives today. But here's the Jewel Tower, as it is today in English Heritage's hands. You can see the remnants of the moat that once surrounded it, that kept it secure. It was originally built in the 1350s or 60s, documentation is a bit sparse, by Edward III, and probably was used for housing valuables, but it could also have been living spaces. Again, very hard to tell. But by the late 15th century, it was only one of a series of towers that stood in the Privy Palace, including one built by Henry VII for, and I'm quoting, the comfort of our Queen. So it's built specifically for Elizabeth of York when she's at Westminster. And that kind of building pattern is entirely typical of what we know of the Privy Palace in this era. You get isolated building projects, putting up a new building or altering an old one and ending up with this kind of jumble of spaces. And I think it's telling that the last English king to try and do a wholesale remodel of the Privy Palace is Richard II, who's well known, of course, for being keen on magnificence and having a very clear sense of what his kingly style was. And I think he really tries to impose his sense of what magnificence should look like on the entirety of the palace, the Privy Palace, and then on his works in Westminster Hall. So what we've got really is a strong sense in the Privy Palace of buildings that have grown up over the centuries, that are being refurbished and redone, that are being rethought, but then the entire site is very rarely, the only example I know of is Richard II, thought of as an entire whole. And so you can see why by 1502, Henry VII is a bit fed up and decides that he'd really prefer to spend most of his time at palaces, which are purpose designed, that fit this new emerging model of what palace architecture should look like. So the Privy Palace is an interesting beast, mostly because it's so tantalizingly unknown. And if we come back to the map now for the third and final area that I want to talk about, St. Stephen's Chapel and College along the riverbank. St. Stephen's Chapel is a major building work, a fantastic piece of architecture begun by Edward I in the 1290s and only completed after a series of mishaps and mischance and running out of money by his grandson Edward III in 1348. Decoration is completed 1360-ish. And in 1348, Edward III founds 2 colleges. And a college for a medieval audience is not a educational establishment. It's a place where a group of priests live together to offer the round of liturgy and music daily, monthly, yearly in the chapel. So in 1348, Edward III founds 2 colleges. At Westminster, he founds the College of St. Stephen in the St. Stephen's Chapel that he is just completing. And at Windsor, he founds St. George's College in the lower ward and starts a rebuilding of the chapel there. And St. George's and St. Stephen's continue to be closely related for the rest of the later Middle Ages. But St. George's has the distinction of being the only such college to survive the Reformation. Every other college that makes it through the Reformation intact has an educational purpose. So we're talking places like Eton or King's College, Cambridge, or some smaller schools that are also collegiate foundations. They all survive because they offer education. St. Stephen's, along with all the others other than St. George's, is dissolved in the 1540s. St. Stephen's goes in 1548. And at that point in 1548, I'm nudging us just beyond the medieval just to explain what's going on with this building. But, in 1548, the college's site is divided, and the upper chapel of St. Stephen's becomes the first permanent home of the House of Commons. So in a palace which by that point is being emptied out of being King's home, it hasn't been a King's home for 20 odd years at that point, the Commons finally acquire a permanent meeting place, and they'll stay there right through to the 19th century. So let's have a look at St. Stephen's Chapel and College and what survives there. This is the reconstruction image on the right of St. Stephen's Chapel as we think it looked like in 1360 when all the decoration had been complete. You can see just how lavish it was, and we had to tone it down because we did the colours and they were super bright, and we estimated how much gold leaf they'd used, which was a lot, and went, ooh, that's a bit bright, and had to figure out how to make it look aesthetically pleasing. So this is the toned down version here. St. Stephen's Chapel is a significant building architecturally at the time, based on the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, or at least closely related to it in terms of design. It had an under chapel dedicated to St. Mary, and then the main chapel of St. Stephen up above, which is what we reconstructed there. And one of the things that's really interesting about St. Stephen's as a space is the deliberate and really quite unusual iconography that they put into the space. So the wall paintings on the eastern wall of the chapel survived with damage until the 19th century. They were panelled over. And so E.W. Tristram was able to make copies, and I've given you a little snippet from his copy of the altar wall mural on the right, on the left. And what's really extraordinary about this is you can see it's St. George, patron saint of England and patron saint of Edward III, leading Edward III by the hand towards the high altar. So the high altar would have been just beside it. And above the high altar, there was an image of the Virgin Mary and Child. So it's an extraordinary statement of Edward III's sense of a personal relationship with the saints. And this set of wall murals then leads to one of the great sort of ironies of the use of St. Stephen's Chapel as a space by the English kings, because in 1388, Richard II, on the eve of the merciless Parliament, which is going to destroy his political situation, really, his favourites are going to be exiled. He's going to be put under very strict restrictions by the members of that Parliament. He holds mass in St. Stephen's the day before that Parliament begins, and at the end of it, wearing his crown, he demands homage from the assembled nobles. And he's doing that with the image of his grandfather, his father, his uncles, the whole dynasty behind him on the walls of the chapel. And its added irony is that one of the people who is pressuring him politically, one of the Lords Appellant, is his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, who is pictured in those altar wall murals. So it's a real defensive statement from Richard. Look, I am the king. This is my heritage. You are going against me and against my grandfather and the whole weight of the dynasty behind me. And that's the mass at which, you know, you would rather like to be there to see just how angry the nobles were at that particular political statement by Richard II. But there are later masses which again show the ongoing use of this chapel by the English kings. In 1415, jumping ahead 30 years or so, we see Henry V at Mass here for Candlemas, the 2nd of February. Ahead of the Agincourt campaign, he's about to start gathering the troops to cross to France, and he holds Mass here, said by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry Chichele. And at the end of that Mass, the offerings that have been offered are so great that there's a dispute about who gets them, which is why this, what must have been a perfectly routine Mass, the king was at Westminster, so the king came to worship here at St. Stephen's, becomes a matter of the historical record. And it's from those kind of scraps that we have to piece together the history of medieval Westminster. The dispute was resolved in favour of the college. Westminster Abbey were not happy. And the third and final Mass that I want to mention tonight is one from the reign of Henry VII. And it's an exercise in imagining how many people you could get into this nave space that I've shown you here in reconstruction, because the chronicler tells us that in the morning after Elizabeth of York was crowned in 1487, Henry VII, his mother, Margaret Beaufort, and the new Queen, Elizabeth of York, came to Mass at St. Stephen's, and they got 80 ladies standing, presumably, in this nave space here to hear the service. It would be a tight fit. I mean, you could probably get 80 people in, but you'd be getting quite close to your neighbour to do it. So again, the sense of the space is space that gets used, that there are people here to see the ceremonial of kingship and of Westminster. And we know, by the way, also the people who came to the law courts could also come and hear Mass at St. Stephen's. So it wasn't just the king and the royal household, it was people coming to Westminster for all sorts of reasons. So St. Stephen's Chapel doesn't survive, sadly. It was taken down, the shell of it was taken down by Charles Barry in the 1340s to build what's now St. Stephen's Hall, leading to the central lobby of the Houses of Parliament. But what does survive is this, St. Mary Undercroft, which is the chapel underneath St. Stephen's in that two-storey structure. It's now the chapel for the Houses of Parliament and of royal peculiar, so you can only really use it for weddings and baptisms and things like that. But it was restored to a pretty decent approximation of its medieval appearance by Edward Barry, who did the watercolour you can see here. And you can see, again, that sense of guilt and that sense of, you know, very lavish decoration. And we know much less about how St. Mary Undercroft was used in the medieval palace, but the few hints we have are really tantalising. So we know there was a font by the west door, and we know that in the early 1510s, a group of knights from Oxfordshire made an indenture that said every year they would pay the rent for their manor of Horsepath in Oxfordshire over the font in St. Mary Undercroft. So what I think must be going on is that they know it's quiet space where they can just quietly slip in the west door when they're at Westminster for the law courts or to see Parliament or whatever else they might be there for, or just you know, plan to come to Westminster. And then they can carry out their transaction and they can slip away again. Otherwise, the space seems mostly to have been used for burials. Other baptisms would also be possible. there's a story that possibly there's one royal wedding that might have been held here, but the documentation isn't terribly clear. So question mark really. But it's lovely that we still got the medieval chapel of St Mary Undercroft quietly sitting within the modern Houses of Parliament. And then the final survivor from the medieval Palace of Westminster is the one that nobody really ever knows, and that is the Cloisters. The Cloisters were built for St Stephen's College. There's first a cloister on the site, we know from the 1355 when they begin building it. And then there's works under Richard II, and there's some hints that the College of St Stephen are doing building works in the mid 15th century. And there's no hint that there's any further building works after the middle of the 15th century. Yet, if you look at that image from Benjamin Stone, circa 1900, of the parliamentary cloisters, that's 16th century crown vaulting. So it's a bit of a puzzle, what's going on here. It's a puzzle that I've taken years to try and crack because there's all sorts of pieces to fit together and it doesn't. But what we know is that if you look at the fan vaulting, it has to be 16th century. That's classic 16th century fan vaulting. We also have what I've given you as the image on the right, the coat of arms of Thomas Wolsey as Cardinal Archbishop of York in the East Walk of the Cloisters. Now, Wolsey is, of course, a fantastic figure and a very influential churchman in his day, but that gives us the date at which the cloisters cannot possibly have been completed beforehand, 1515, when the year after he's made archbishop and the year in which he's made cardinal. So we know that this cloister has to be finished after 1515. We also know from the evidence of the other coats of arms to be found in this cloister that it can't really be finished much after, say, 1526, 27, because the most common heraldry you find here is the coat of arms and badge of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. And it's probably not a very good idea politically to put the coat of arms of Catherine of Aragon into your new building project if you're the College of St Stephen right next to the King's government after about 1526, 27, when the divorce case really starts going. So that's what we can tell from the structure. We have no building accounts whatsoever for this space. What we do have is the account of John Stowe in his survey of London at the end of the 16th century. And he tells us these cloisters of curious workmanship were built at a charge of 11,000 marks by the last dean of the college, John Chamber. Chamber is dean from 1514, so that doesn't narrow it down much. It just tells us that yes, it would have been finished in Chamber's deanery, because he's dean from 1514 to 1548 when the college is dissolved. And so that doesn't get us much further ahead. But if we start thinking about the institutional history of St Stephen's College and the people who are there in the early 16th century, it starts becoming really rather interesting, because it turns out that Cardinal Wolsey's arms being in the cloister is not a function of him being Henry VIII's chief minister, which would be perfectly reasonable to add. Instead, it's because from 1512 to 1514, he's the dean. He is the man responsible for the institution as a whole. And he seems to have really liked St Stephen's College. He's actively bringing in priests that he knows to serve as canons, including his unofficial brother-in-law, Thomas Lark. And Lark's really interesting because he's also a very experienced builder himself. He oversees the works of the King's Palace of Bridewell. He's involved in Wolsey's later building campaigns elsewhere. So when you start putting those things together, you start thinking, this looks an awful lot like a Thomas Wolsey building project that he may have started in those 2 years of his deanery, and that was then completed under his successor, John Chamber. And that's really interesting because in that case, what we've got is a fan vaulted cloister of the type of, extraordinary workmanship being begun in Westminster at a time when we tend to think the palace is becoming less used because of the 1512 fire. It's Thomas Wolsey putting in a huge amount of effort to do something really flamboyant and really interesting within the palace. The cloisters are an enigma that then survived fire and flood and bombs. They're the most battered bits of the survivors, really. You can see on Wolsey's coat of arms that it's lost bits of the masonry, and that's unfortunately the case for quite a lot of it. But you can still see the stunning craftsmanship that went into it. 2 of the walks of this cloister were destroyed by bombing in 1940. But fortunately, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, who rebuilt the House of Commons after the Second World War, also was given the contract to rebuild those 2 walks, the east and the south walks. And you can see on the image his very pristine white stonework, carefully carved, very distinctive, into which the original bosses at the top of the vaulting were inserted to restore the scheme as it was. So the cloisters are well worth a visit if you ever get a chance. They've been used as office space for the last 40 odd years, but they're now slowly being cleaned and repaired, and I keep on hoping that one day people will be able to visit them properly. And the last bit of the cloisters that I'm just going to very quickly note is the oratories. And again, like the rest of the cloisters, these are a puzzle. They project into the cloister garth on the western side. And again, like the rest of the cloisters, they're a bit battered by time and pollution and everything else. But they're a bit of a surprise because you don't often see building cloisters which have structures inserted into them. The best known example of this type of thing is the chapter house at Old St. Paul's, which is a 14th century building by William Ramsay. And that would suggest that it's indeed a chapter house, or at least one half of it is a chapter house. And for various reasons, I'm pretty sure I can say that the lower of the 2 oratories, so this one here, was probably the college's chapter house. And here's a drawing of it from just after 1834's fire. And so if that's the college's chapter house, that's where in 1533, Thomas Cranmer takes his oath of obedience to the papacy when he's made Archbishop of Canterbury, and receives the pallium, the mark of the archbishopric, from the Pope's representative. Of course, within months, Cranmer will abjure the papacy and will start England on the road to the Reformation. So there's a lovely little bit of double dealing that happens in the chapter house at St. Stephen's. Cranmer is then consecrated as Archbishop in St. Stephen's Chapel itself before the formalities at Canterbury. So these rather battered buildings may very well have elements of the story of the Reformation, and of course they have a much longer afterlife beyond the medieval palace. I want to finish by thinking about the 1834 fire, as you can see on this image of the panorama by George Scharf. Obviously, fire and flood are a massive part of Westminster's story. There have been many more fires than the 2 I've already mentioned. But 1834 really is a stunning moment in the history of the medieval palace of Westminster, because in the centuries after 1512, the medieval buildings are largely hidden away. They're covered by neoclassical facades, they're massively altered. If you went into the House of Commons in 1834, you would have no idea that the House of Commons met in a medieval chapel, because the it's all been panelled, it's all been completely altered. So when the fire sweeps through in 1384, suddenly the medieval palace is laid bare, and antiquarians and the public can see for the first time that the buildings they knew as neoclassical or otherwise modern actually sat within the shell of a much older palace. So when Charles Barry is commissioned to rebuild the Houses of Parliament in the 1340s, he's working within a building that has both been hidden for centuries and has been laid open to visitors for the first time. And so I think it's striking that he keeps St. Mary Undercroft and he keeps the cloisters, but he takes down the walls of St. Stephen's, which you can see there, in order to make his St. Stephen's Hall and the entranceway to Parliament. So the 1384 fire is just a really interesting moment in the history of this building. And I'll just finish by saying, if you want more information, first about the work I'm currently doing with the medieval exchequer, both in England and in Ireland, the website for that project is Beyond 2022. And if you want to see the reconstructions of the full reconstructions and move around the palace a bit in digital form, those can be found at the St. Stephen's Chapel project website. And I'll just stop sharing screens now so we can go to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Oh, Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was a real tour de force, and the historical detail was amazing, and you're a really fantastic storyteller. But I haven't heard Watergate mentioned in a non-corrupt way for an awfully long time, so that's really, really super. Thanks again. We'll have the opportunity after Q&A to give you a proper thank you together. So the Q&A, everyone, Jules will keep looking at the chat, but if you'd like to ask a question, perhaps one of you would like to unmute and go ahead.
Okay, I'll just kick off with Chris, a question from Chris. I think he wrote this actually while you were talking about the 1834 fire. Do we know how these parts of the medieval palace survived the Great Fire of 1834, and whether other parts survived but were dismantled?
A lot of the palace was deliberately dismantled. Rosemary Hill, who's done a lot of work on the antiquarian element of the 18th and 19th century interest in the palace, reckons that if the fire had happened 10, 20 years later, a lot more would have been kept. They'd have done a lot more structural stabilizing to keep elements of the palace. The cloisters survive because they're in the shadow of Westminster Hall. They sit between St. Stephen's Chapel and Westminster Hall. And the famous quotation from one MP during the fire is, forget about the rest of the palace, save Westminster Hall, put all the firefighting resources into keeping the hall safe. And they do. It doesn't go up in flames. It's a near thing though.
Yes, absolutely. Chris also, he was struck linguistically by the transition that you mentioned of the royal courts to the civil courts. Probably a subject in itself for a talk, but any comments?
Yeah, it is really interesting. For the medieval period, it's very strongly the case that the king is the fount of justice. Everything that is done by royal government is done in the king's name. And in theory, he's supposed to know everything that's going on. In reality, he can't possibly, it's far too complicated. But there's a lovely moment, which I'm afraid I only know the sketchiest bit about, of in the 19th century, when the proposal was made to move the courts out of Westminster Hall, and the Sir John Soane, very early 19th century, is being commissioned to build new court buildings. One justice insists that because of Magna Carta, you cannot move them 1 inch from where they were in Westminster Hall, and so it's a real process of trying to work out, can they be somewhere else? Do they need to be there? So yes, there is a process, and I'm afraid it is something I don't fully know, but that's the one thing that comes to mind.
Okay, thank you. Another question here from Sarah Jane, that you mentioned that the sheriffs would have had to attend the exchequer, but why was that?
Because the sheriffs are responsible for collecting revenue in their localities. So the dog has decided, apologies, she's decided to have a shout. I hope you can hear me over her. The reason the sheriffs have to account is because they're responsible for collecting revenue locally and bringing it to Westminster. So they're sent the list of revenue that the king is expecting from the shire they're responsible for, and then they are the ones who often carry it to Westminster, and they're often sent messages saying, can you pay so and so this amount of money and we'll deduct it when your accounts are settled at Westminster. So they're part of a complicated credit system, as it were. So they must have sat there looking very nervous indeed, as all the allowances were totted up.
Okay, that's lovely. Sarah adds superb talk. She learned so much. From Marie, can you say a little about the river at the time of the college? How marshy was it? What sort of shape was it, etc.?
Yeah, I can say a bit more about that. They're doing land reclamation projects all through the later Middle Ages, so it's gradually moving. The river's being narrowed at this point as they push out bits of land for the palace. When St. Stephen's Chapel is built, they put stakes, I think would probably be the best word to use, into the river so the passing boats can't bump into the chapel. You know, so it's right on the river edge. But then by the later 14th century, they pushed it out a bit, and so there's gardens there. So they're clearly doing, you know, kind of those slow, determined, build a wall, infill behind it, trying to push out the river a bit. It runs, in terms of how it runs, it's pretty straight there. There's a bit of wobbling, it's clear, and it's floods are always a problem. I think Westminster Hall floods itself, and you saw how deep that distance was in the 1290s, I want to say. There's some of the London chroniclers complain about the whole flooding, so it's nothing like the embankment today. You know, you couldn't be sure that you weren't going to get flooded out.
Okay. Another question from Victor. Victor, hi. Did people feel that they got fair justice?
I think people...
Victor, do you want to unmute yourself? You want to ask that, Victor? I'm not sure what he means about that.
Well, I can have a stab at it, and if I get this wrong...
Now, can I just...
yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
When people came to Westminster Hall, whether they were ordinary people or sheriffs or whatever, was there a sense that the justice was fair, or was it fixed with the money changing hands together? Do they come away in general feeling that they were getting a fair deal?
Well, there were quite a lot of mechanisms that you could use to move around royal justice, and the final...
Elizabeth, you're not going off again.
Sorry, is that better? There's lots, when it comes to law in this period, there's lots of ways you can maneuver around it, and the systems are so multi-layered. So you've got the local courts, the manorial courts, you've got the king's courts, you've got overview courts. So there's... I'm
really sorry, Elizabeth.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Is it?
I can still hear it. I don't...
No, is that... I don't know what it's doing. Let me see if that's... Is that stopped it? Yeah, is that better? Apologies. I really
That's
not entirely sure what's going on.
Everyone, we're all thinking.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry about this. If I go back to the start of that answer, what I think the thing that people see as guaranteeing fairness in this period is that you can go to the council and say, I have been treated unjustly. This is why I feel I've been treated unjustly. You don't have to point to a particular point of law. You can say, so there's the principle that this stuff can be reviewed and that you're not bound by statutory law if it's unfair. So there's mechanisms. I'm sure there are people who felt that it was too expensive, that they'd had to spend a huge amount of time traipsing around Westminster, that their case hadn't been heard quickly enough. It's a very slow process. But we do see petitions of people saying, I've been treated unjustly, can you do something about it? And those petitions do seem to be taken seriously. So there's a mechanism to deal with unfairness, I think is what I'd say.
Thank you, fantastic talk.
That sounds really good. James has got a question. The buildings around the Jewel Tower were demolished in the 1950s in order to create its moat.
Yeah.
It was filled in with water. It was then drained in 1980 because of the leakage into the underground car park adjacent. Would you agree that it should be waterproofed and refilled?
That's an interesting one. I don't know enough about that area of the palace to really be able to think about all of the different considerations in how you deal with it. But I quite like it as it is now, because you can quite clearly see that it was a moat, and given that it's now separated by quite some distance from where the moat would have originally gone, being able to see that there's a bit of moat there, but without necessarily needing water seems reasonable to me. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on that. I do know that when they built that underground car park in the 80s, I assume, they found some of the original 14th century walls down there. So there's elements of the medieval palace that were found in those excavations and are still there for all I know.
Nice one. I just wanted to ask you a question. That the piece of mural that you showed,
Yeah.
Are there any other examples that still survive of that mural?
We've got the drawings of it. We've got Tristan did a full reconstruction of the mural, the two halves of the mural at the lower levels. But what we do have, which is even better, which I maybe could have brought in, but they're actually really hard to photograph. There are chunks of masonry at the British Museum. So if you go to the British Museum and look in their European galleries, they have chunks of masonry that the antiquarians quite literally pried from the walls of St. Stephen's and took away in the early 19th century. And we've got, so that's what we can base some of our knowledge about the decoration of the chapel on, is that we've got elements of that painting scheme, which shows the Old Testament scenes. So we've got the altar wall murals and we've got actual bits of masonry.
Okay, thank goodness they were saved.
Yeah.
Do you think that is it very likely that it would have been as gaudy as you imagine? And where do you get that from? Is it from samples of paint?
We've got the paint on the surviving chunks of mural, and we've got the paint in what the antiquarians were able to draw in the 19th century, when they could literally get behind the paneling and sort of have a lantern and sort of poke their way through and draw what they saw. But we also have the building accounts, so those have been edited recently. And we can see just how much paint they're buying and what colours they're buying. So we know they're buying an extraordinary amount of gold leaf. I'm not quite sure where they put all of it, honestly, but they buy just huge amounts of the stuff. And they buy a lot of red paint, and they buy a lot of blue paint, and they buy, there's some very specific colours that they buy. And so what the art historians were able to do for that 2016 reconstruction was say, this is the kind of thing we'd expect to see. This is the surviving colour scheme that we've got from these fragments, and this is the paint that we know they're buying. These are the pigments. let's create an impressionistic view of what that might have looked like. So that's how we ended up with that level of gaudy.
Yes, lovely.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to looking at that reconstruction. Anthony asks, where did the furniture go to?
What do you mean by furniture?
The furniture possibly from the chapel?
Well,
Anthony, we can't mute Anthony just so he can make that clear. Sorry, hold on a second.
That's fine.
No,
Okay,
good evening.
yeah,
I just wanted to know where all the furniture and the chattels went to, in all the rooms, etc. Did they go to other palaces, or were they destroyed and burnt in the fires?
Ooh, that's a really good question. The answer is going to be, there's two different answers, as it were. There'll have been some stuff that was just in the palace, you know, that was left in the palace year round. So the King's table in Westminster Hall is made of stone, and you just leave it in place. You don't bother trying to move it. So they found fragments of that when they did some archaeology maybe 30 years ago in Westminster Hall. Most furniture for the medieval palaces is pretty sparse, and it's the kind of tables and things that you can take apart and you just bring them with you. So for the Privy Palace, after 1512, I cannot imagine there was much in there, that they were pretty empty rooms, maybe with a few forgotten bits in corners. For St. Stephen's Chapel, it's interesting because we know that the altar plate and the furnishings, the tapestries, the really expensive stuff, were all handed over to Protector Somerset, Edward VI's uncle, and so he gets, you know, some very nice furnishings indeed out of that. Whereas the pews, there wouldn't have been seats in the nave space, but there were the inbuilt choir stalls, and we think those are probably adapted for the House of Commons, that they probably used those in the early years of the chapel being the House of Commons. So I imagine, you know, and then for Westminster Hall, they were used to taking things out and putting things back in so routinely that they probably just had storehouses where they kept materials and locked up what they needed at any one time, and then when that event was done, took it apart and kept what could be kept and reused and discarded or burned what couldn't be used. So I'm not sure there is a sort of furnishing in the way we think of a palace being furnished that would then be.
Do we know where the tapestries went to?
Yes, in the sense, we know some tapestries went to Whitehall. Some, the Armada set, stayed in the palace and were used by the House of Lords. So there were still tapestries in the palace for a long period after in the House of Lords areas. We don't know what happens to the vestments and hangings that Protector Somerset took. We just know that he had them for a time. What you tend to see happens with religious hangings and things like that is they're cut down for other uses, or they're repurposed into, you know, domestic table coverings and things. So they were expensive, so you'd want to keep using them. You wouldn't just throw them out, but you would probably, you know, find a secular use for them.
Thank you.
Okay, that's lovely. I don't think there are any more questions. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute themselves.
Yeah, so that we can say a proper thank you to Elizabeth. And I know that I will be watching this recording over and over again to really dive in to all the details. So thank you ever so much, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you all for coming and listening to medieval Westminster on a lovely Tuesday evening.
Oh, absolutely super. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
And see everyone on the 11th of May for our next talk.